Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that is officially declaring it Hot Digger Summer. I'm Ben Molyneux Hetherington and I'm joined by Adam Spears. Adam, we both know that Gerard Winstanley was the original girl boss, but in honour of Hot Digger Summer, what do you believe his biggest slay was?
I wish I had some foreknowledge of what you were going to say in these introductions, because it's always just something completely out there, and I don't know how to respond to that. Like, girl boss and Gerard Winstanley were not two things I expected to go together, I'm going to be honest.
Well, it's Hot Digger Summer, right? And I feel like, was it last summer or was it the summer before, there was the Hot Girl Summer meme, and I feel like if we're going to make that Hot Digger Summer, then we've got to fully engage in that kind of, that whole culture.
You're a year out of date, Ben.
I think I might be 2 years out of date. I'm not going to lie to you.
I mean, you're doing better than I am. I lived my whole life out of date, so...
Yeah, well, I mean, we're two blokes in our 30s, right? We shouldn't be that in date anymore.
Rub it in.
I put us in the same age bracket there. I didn't know my usual attack on your age.
God, you're in your 30s now.
Oh, yeah, I'm 31, mate. I'm well in there.
Wow.
It's when you meant to peak, right? Your 30s?
Sure, why not?
Has that happened for you?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Like, turning 30, there was only one reason turning 30 felt weird for me, and it was because after 30, in football, you're seen as on the decline in your career, so you're sort of going downhill from that point, and that was the point where I was like, I'm obviously not going to be a professional footballer.
Yeah, no, I genuinely had the same experience with rugby. Like, yeah, maybe it's time to give up these dreams. Like, yeah.
Yeah, it's very odd. Possibly I could have known this considerably earlier than that, but I didn't want to kill my dreams,
No, 100%. Like, I'm not even joking. That is exactly the thing where I was like, at some point now I'm going to have to come to terms with the fact that I'm not going to suddenly be like... I mean, for me at least, I was playing rugby semi-regularly, so there was this possibility that someone would be like, wow, look at the raw talent on this guy. If we put him in some real training, we can make him, turn him into a professional rugby player.
Yeah, whereas for me, I'm literally disabled, so it was never going to happen anyway,
Just going back to the intro, as listeners might know, I tend to put together the notes. Yes, there are in fact notes. We are, despite what it sounds like,
wait, there are?
We're not just rambling, whatever. Yeah. Now, I might be the only one who looks at them, but they are there. And I would reckon that I spend maybe 80% of the prep time thinking about what to say in the intro to try and either shock you or make you laugh.
To be fair, I did really try hard to kind of mimic that when I had to host last week, because you were off gallivanting around somewhere or something. So I did put some effort into trying to come up with a moderately witty opening. I'm not sure how well it went. Answers on a postcard, I
think the thing is, you're meant to have the same intro or a similar intro to try and introduce the podcast to give people a sense of what you're about. But also, I get bored too easily saying the same thing. So it's just the two of us. We are a Lou down. Lou is in Spain.
Spain. It's all right for some, isn't it?
Yeah. So Lou is busy over the summer, so we might not see much of them over the coming few weeks, unfortunately.
We only just got them back.
I know. They, I think, have stuff going on in their lives, whereas, at least for me, when I miss an episode, it is universally because I've had to go to work.
I think I've literally only missed one episode, and it was very recently. I think I was away on placement, so there's nothing I can do about that.
Again, which is basically just work. Whereas Lou actually has stuff going on in their life, so they get to actually go and do things and then pop in when they're able to, whereas you and I, we're mostly sat at home anyway, so,
Yeah, well, I've got no money. That's mostly what it is,
We are going to do a bit more talk about diggers and other kind of religious radicals during what we learned last week should be called the War of the Three Kingdoms, which was new information.
Wars. Yeah, listening to it back, I kept saying war, and I was like, wars, Adam, wars, you know nothing.
It was really exciting. Usually I am in the episode, or at least I get to hear it before. This one, I got to experience it completely blind, and it was very exciting, and I learned a lot, and it made me want to talk more about diggers, and what we can kind of learn from them, take from them, how we might kind of think about diggers in our own contexts and all that sort of stuff. So we're going to do a bit of that, and I think we're probably, over the summer, going to do a fair bit of diggers content. We'll see how it goes. We don't like to make too firm plans because then we forget to do them, but I hope you all like diggers because that is what we're going to be talking about this hot digger summer. Do you like diggers, Adam?
I like many kinds of diggers.
Yeah, how do you feel about that? Have you been to Digger World?
No, I haven't, sadly. I like the concept. I'm not sure how you can make a whole tourist attraction, out of it.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, we're talking about this is like a theme park based around construction diggers.
Which is so niche. I'm sorry, that is so niche.
But also, little boys and girls a bit like, because that's what they're encouraged to do. Little boys are often given little digger toys, right? And they love them. So I don't know. Maybe it is.
I mean, I'd rather give them diggers than like soldiers.
Ideally, we should have a Winstanley like doll that we give kids, but
riding in a digger.
Yes, absolutely. Historically confusing, but entertaining to play with.
Yeah.
Before all of that, though, shall we do some new podcast, same old nonsense? Shall we start, Adam, by talking about immigration?
I will start by talking about immigration. I want to talk about the story of Ibrahima Bar, who is a 19-year-old asylum seeker who has just been on trial, and the jury has just been discharged for this trial. It's incredible to read this because this was not illegal, and under international law it's not illegal, but in the UK, of course, because we have a regressive Tory government, it is now illegal. He is accused of piloting a dinghy across the English Channel in which 4 people drowned, and there are other charges as well. Basically, you're seen as a trafficker, and so he's on trial for 4 counts of manslaughter and facilitating unlawful entry to the UK, so essentially human trafficking, right? What this man has done, and I say man, he's 19, right? Yes, legally he's a man, but he's a young man. What he's done is he's got into a dinghy with other people, and he's volunteered to be the one who steers the dinghy. It's gone wrong, it's overturned, 4 people have drowned, right? All of these people are asylum seekers, including this man. And now he's being treated... This is not... The manslaughter thing, obviously that's new, that's just come in because they're claiming that if you're the one piloting the dinghy, then you're the one committing the manslaughter.
Yeah.
The facilitating unlawful entry to the UK, that's also a new law, come in very recently. That goes against international law. Under international law, which the UK has signed up to, there is no illegal way to enter a country if you're seeking asylum. But the UK has decided that there is, and so this man is standing trial. However, the jury's been dismissed, presumably because they couldn't come to a decision, and he's got to stand trial again on the 15th of January next year. The laws we have on immigration are already disgusting.
Yeah.
And I think that word doesn't even do it justice. What I've just described should shock us all. But this government are still trying to force through, and have just successfully forced through, even more aggressive laws. The illegal migration bill has passed all parliamentary stages now. It may well, by the time this comes out, have received royal assent. One of the final issues with it was that there were a few amendments in the House of Lords, mostly from bishops, specifically one from the Archbishop of Canterbury, which called for a 10-year cross-party strategy to address the refugee and human trafficking crisis. It was trying to put in safeguards to stop some of the more really, really nasty things in this bill from coming into law. And there was another one from another bishop, I think, that tried to limit the maximum detention of children under this bill to 5 days, but that also has been dropped. So both those have been dropped now. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, said that he was dropping this because basically there was no government support. Even though his amendment passed in the Lords, it didn't pass in the Commons, so he basically wanted to stop what he called the ping-pong stage, where it just goes back between houses.
Which, by the way, was a terrible decision, because the longer it ping-pongs, the longer it's prevented from coming into law, which is exactly what you want to be doing.
And I mean, their argument will be, well, that's undemocratic. The whole bloody thing is undemocratic. Yeah,
you're an unelected lord. You don't get to really complain about undemocratic stuff, right? If you're that concerned about democracy, I have a proposal.
Well, indeed. And actually, that's where I want to kind of take this, because nothing that they have done, or very, very little that they have done, the bishops that are in the House of Lords, has been really seriously considered by this government, because this government I mean, one of the incredible things that Justin Welby said to try and justify his amendment was that these laws, you don't know what kind of government you're going to get later on, and they might use them for really bad things. And I'm like, Justin, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but have you not been watching for the last 13 years, right? And especially at the moment, we have one of the most regressive governments that we've ever had. The human trafficking, as he calls it, and immigration crisis is a crisis of human rights that have been undermined deliberately by this government and previous Conservative and frankly, Lib Dem and Labour governments as well. He wanted to put in measures so that any future government that might be really bad wouldn't do really bad things. They're already doing really, really awful, awful things. And I think at this point, we said it before when we were talking about something, I think possibly this very bill. My point was, it ain't going to work, at which point you need to do something more drastic, like just withdraw from the House of Lords. Say you're going to refuse to sit in the House of Lords because nothing you do is working anyway. I think that time has long passed, right? If you can't even get this tiny little amendment in place, amendments that stop bloody children being detained for more than 5 days, why are you there? Why are you there at that point?
Yeah.
It's time to do something more drastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, it feels like we spend a lot of time complaining about immigration, but it really is just despicable what is being done to these people. And I simply cannot see how anyone can justify it as anything other than just vicious, unnecessary spite.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St George's College in Jerusalem, says, I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering. To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
And to be clear, Justin Welby and the bishops largely agree with us on this, right? That's why we're talking about this. Justin Welby thinks that this is, an awful bill. He's actually called this, the fact that he's had to withdraw, or he sees it, had to withdraw it. He says that this is a failure of reconciliation. He's got a book coming out soon about reconciliation, so it's clearly on the mind. Reconciliation has the potential to be a wonderful thing, but there's a certain liberal mindset that places the idea of reconciliation above other ideas such as justice for the oppressed, right? And I think they would not see themselves as doing that. They want justice for the oppressed, right? But this liberal approach to things like reconciliation always privileges that concept of reconciliation over actual justice for those who need it. And that's why we always see this kind of thing happening where, we're talking a good talk, but nothing's actually happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to something depressing, but maybe less depressing, just how ridiculous and stupid it is. John Howard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, not a good man, I think is a very gentle way of putting that, had this to say, brace yourself. I do hold the view that the luckiest thing that happened to this country was being colonised by the British. Not that they were perfect by any means, but they were infinitely more successful and beneficent colonisers than other European countries. I honestly cannot quite believe a human being has said this in earnest. It's an insane thing to say.
I'm going to disagree with you, Ben. I think he's right.
And it's been lovely to have you all for Bread and Moses. This is the final episode.
No, I'll tell you what I mean, right? So, what is Australia? Australia is a white man's country. Australia is the colonisation. And so, by saying the best thing that's happened to Australia is being colonised by the British, well, that is its founding. Right? Australia isn't the landmass. Australia isn't the native Australians. Australia is the political entity that the British put in place. And so, for its very existence, he's right. But actually, of course, for the people who actually already lived there, he's very, very wrong and misguided.
Yeah. And I think we take an abolish Australia stance. Obviously, that's partially due to the colonial history, but mostly due to their tendency to beat us at sporting fixtures.
Well, I mean, I take an abolish all countries stance, Ben. So
yeah, but if we're going to start anywhere, like Australia and America would be my
good place to start.
Yeah.
Which is rich coming from us.
Oh yeah. To be fair, like ideally, you'd probably start with us and then go from there. But like. So this is in the context of a referendum to basically set up a new infrastructure to give Indigenous Australians more of a voice. It is literally called Voice to Parliament. I don't know the details about it, but what's pretty clear is that for all its many, many flaws, the people in favour of this referendum are basically well-meaning liberals, and the people against it are hardcore racists. And if you want to draw any comparisons to previous referendums in this country, that would be on your own back. Absolute madness, though, to have said that colonisation is a good thing. I hear what you're saying about, well, the country of Australia exists because of colonisation, but to come out and publicly declare that you think what is essentially a genocidal policy from the British to a country or a landmass that already had people happily living there. I mean, it's probably more revealing than you mean it to be, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I'm being tongue-in-cheek to make the point that, Australia as a concept didn't even exist. So the foundations of his idea are based in a falsehood.
Yeah. I don't think there's loads I want to say about that, mainly because my knowledge of Indigenous rights in Australia was not particularly strong. But yes, as a British person, I've got to say, no, you do not have to be nice about the British. We were the bad guys.
Yes, you're right. Be nasty about the British colonising everywhere as well. But colonisation is such a multifarious and kind of almost nebulous kind of thing. And one of the ways I look at this is to think about, how colonisation started in what became the UK. There's an argument to say that the first people colonised by the English were the English, right? I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that because we started off as a lot of warring kingdoms with tribes coming in, etc., etc. But if we don't take that view, then the first people colonised by what was England by that point were the Welsh. And we're talking 1,000 years ago. And then you have the Scottish coming in later. The Scottish actually eventually joined the Union with the English willingly, right? Because they've basically run out of money because their own attempt at colonization failed. And that's how the UK came into being, right? So you had Wales, which was annexed by the English and considered a part of England, effectively. So that's the first place colonized. And then you had the Scots, who came into union with England willingly. And I find both of those things really interesting because, of course, Welsh and Scottish people participated, pretty wholeheartedly in the colonization of the rest of the world, right? That's one thing. But then, on top of that, you look at how colonizers get the populations of the countries that they are colonizing to colonize themselves. You know, it's that famous thing of India being run by two blokes on a bicycle or something, right? Because most of the legwork, you know, it shows how hegemony is a thing, right? Because you convince this section, it's divide and conquer, and you convince this section to do your dirty work for you. It's a really nasty process that people don't quite realize the intricacies of how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, I think at some point we'll need to delve a bit more deeply into colonization and obviously the specifically Christian character of a lot of colonization as well is well worth delving into. The final bit of news that we want to cover is some news about same-sex marriage in the Church of England. We will be as quick as possible because God knows I am sick of going on about this. You know what we think about this. You know how mad we are. Something interesting has happened, though. I can't remember if we even talked about this, but a while ago there was some letter sent by a bunch of dickheads / vicars.
Wow. Ben, you know that the two co-hosts of your podcast... Oh, no, yeah, fair. I mean...
to be clear, I am not like saying that they are dickheads because they are vicars, although I might say that in a different context, but in this case, they are vicars who are being dickheads.
Ben doesn't talk for Lou and I. However, sending this letter is a dickhead move, I'll be honest. So.
This letter basically is a bunch of people involved in the Church of England saying that the prayers of love and faith that have been added to the Church of England, which was an extremely small but welcome step forward for integrating same-sex couples into church life, shouldn't go ahead because they've not gone through the correct process. First of all, that appears not to be true. Second of all, that's pretty obviously an attempt to stop something you don't like through pointless proceduralism. Anyway, one of the people who signed it was Archie Coates, who is the vicar of HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, which is one of the largest, most influential churches.
Is he the vicar? I thought he's the vicar of St Augustine's, which is affiliated to HTB, isn't he?
No, HTB swallowed St Augustine's whole.
Oh, is that how? Oh, right.
Yeah. To be fair, by all accounts, the St Augustine's congregation were actually quite happy with how this has gone, but it was a slightly different type of church community that came under the HTB auspices, but continued to some extent to have a level of its own kind of style and approach. I believe it's a slightly more high church or traditional style. Anyway, a bunch of people from that community, St Augustine's, have written an email and then shared the email publicly to Archie Coates, basically to say how upset they were that he was prepared to sign this email. Some of the key quotes were, "As a group, we feel that the letter is a cleverly worded delaying tactic specifically designed to frustrate a decision which has already been voted upon. It can only be concluded that this has been done to prolong discrimination by procedural default." Which is, about right. He also says, "It's significant that some who feel strongly about this in our congregation are what one of the signatories to the letter calls UK Global Majority members," which is obviously an attempt to push back against the idea that, well, of course, it is people of colour who really don't like, and people from particularly African countries who don't want this, and so actually you're being racist by trying to push same-sex marriage through, which is just a despicable and obviously wrong argument to make.
Which we see time and again, by the way, Justin Welby himself pushed something very, very similar in order to get out of trying to hold... I think it was Ugandan bishops to account or something?
Yeah, can't remember what it was. But we talked about this before, didn't we? Yeah. Anyway, what's really interesting to see is that a group of people within the church as in within HTB, have been pushing back against this. There has always been a question about how or what line HTB were going to take, and it was revealing and sad to see at least the kind of higher level of leadership within that kind of grouping and church take the anti-same-sex marriage approach. And there's a line at the end here that I think is revealing. Several members of the congregation, including the writer of this letter, are having to evaluate whether we can, in all conscience, continue to worship within the parish because of this letter. I suspect there will be others, both on the staff and within other services, who may be feeling uneasy too. And that seems to suggest to me that the leadership, at least the senior leadership, is on one page, but there is disquiet within those congregations. And I do suspect that if we're going to see change, it's going to come from those people in the pews pushing back against what their senior leadership are saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's encouraging to see this within the HTB network as well. Yeah. I mean, not just within the network, but within a church that is considered a part of HTB itself. I think this is a really big step, and yeah, I mean, probably they don't listen to our podcast, but
hello if you do, though. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah.
Maybe we should be nicer to evangelicals. I'm not going to be, but maybe you should, Adam. You should be nice.
I mean, I do try to be nicer than you. But that's not bloody hard, is it?
Yeah, not difficult. No, you are slightly more. I don't want to say inclusive because that's the opposite of what we're talking about here.
Well, I mean, what I will say, and we'll probably do an episode about evangelicalism at some point, is that whilst I am not an evangelical myself, I was one, and there are lots of very, very good people who have been really supportive and are evangelicals. And, whilst I would have issues with some of the underpinning kind of ideologies behind evangelicalism, there's clearly a difference between evangelicalism as it presents generally in the USA, where we hear a lot of the really awful stuff, and evangelicalism as it presents in the UK. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of evangelical churches in the UK that do a lot of awful stuff and are at the worst end of things, but it is to say that there's a stream of evangelicalism, especially within the UK, that kind of manages to avoid some of the worst stuff that comes with evangelicalism.
I do think you're right about that. I would say, though, that there is also an effective tactic that they do use, which is to compare to the most extreme examples of US evangelicalism and say, well, we're not as bad as that, despite the fact that they are still homophobic, anti-abortion. A shocking number of evangelical churches still don't support women. But this is what I'm saying, though, is actually there are evangelical churches for whom none of those things actually are the case, right? They do support women. They are HTB affirming. Well, a lot of them are. We are an HTB non-affirming podcast, I'm afraid.
Yeah, sue us.
Please don't. Yeah. 20% of their congregation are lawyers, so that's a dangerous game to play.
Yeah, that's true. But no, the point is that there are a growing number of evangelical churches that are affirming of the LGBTQ plus community, that are affirming of women in leadership. And I think it's important to recognise that rather than just sort of, even if I may have issues with, some of the core tenets of evangelicalism, it's important to recognise that they're not all doing that nasty, nasty stuff. And that there is, there are good people working within that and improvements are being made here and there. Not enough, and not quickly enough, but...
You almost... it felt like you were like, before you say anything...
Well, because I knew you bloody would, Ben.
I'll let you have the last word if you want, Adam. That's fine.
I think I've made my my point. Evangelicals are all wonderful, and we should join them.
Cool. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Again, thank you for joining us. This is the last episode. Let us move on to what else is on my mind grapes.
What else is on my mind grapes?
On my mind grapes this week is something that I was very delighted to see because I knew almost nothing about it, is that we have a shop now. And we're not just going to plug the shop in mind grapes. There is something going that I'm going towards. But Adam, you have been working very hard on creating a bunch of fun Bread and Rosaries merch. You have worked with my frankly dodgy design skills in the original creation of the logo, along with some other cool stuff, including a Gerard Winstanley quote you can get on a sticker or a mug or all sorts of different things. So that is, if you go to breadandrosaries.com and click on shop, you find it there. On there, I was drawn to something particular that you designed, Adam, which is a fantastic both t-shirt and sticker. I think you get it on a mug as well and all sorts of things. And it says, Jesus is a communist, which is a bold statement. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about this. And particularly, I wanted to talk about why we're happy saying that, and also maybe talk a little bit about why we wouldn't be happy to say Jesus was a communist, but we're very happy to say Jesus is a communist.
Yeah, I pretty much always say is rather than was, because for me, as a Christian, it's a demonstration of what I believe theologically about Jesus and who Jesus is, that Jesus is alive, right? And I think
that's my understanding, yes.
Right, yeah.
That seems relatively central to the whole Christianity thing.
Yeah, turns out. I mean, there are some people like John Dominic Crossan who would disagree, right? But
and no shade to those people. Like, that's cool. You do you.
Yeah, he's written some good books. I mean,
yeah, the majority of Christianity is probably focused on the whole Jesus still being alive thing.
It's pretty. Yeah, I mean, certainly creedal kind of Christianity would be. Yeah. So I always say Jesus is a communist. There's nothing wrong with saying Jesus was a communist, but I always feel a little bit like I'm kind of, if I were to like have something that said Jesus was a communist, I would feel like by having that or wearing that or whatever it was, I would kind of be saying, oh, look at me, I'm an edgy atheist who wants to, use this Jesus figure to piss off some Christians. And actually, no, I'm an edgy Christian who wants to use this Jesus figure to piss off some Christians. Right?
It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I mean, I get a lot of pushback for this. People saying you can't put a modern category onto Jesus, or people going further and saying Jesus isn't political. I mean, that's demonstrably nonsense, said by people who don't understand what, neither what politics is or what Jesus was doing. But the sort of other point about, you can't say Jesus is a communist, you can't put a modern ideology onto someone who lived 2,000 years ago. We have associated communism with Marxism. There's nothing really inherently wrong with that. Marxism, it's cool. I draw from it a lot too. But communism is a broader and older concept than that. And a lot of scholars of early Christianity use the term communism in its kind of earlier sense to talk about communities that held things in common, shared, and made sure that nobody went without, sort of undid a lot of hierarchies, that kind of thing. And they used that to describe, many early Christian communities. I think why this is interesting at the moment, I think from our point of view, apart from anything, is that last week we were talking with, and we'll get into this, but we were talking with Liv in our previous episode about Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers. And Liv made the point that basically, you don't need to say that the Diggers are proto-communists or anarchists or whatever it is to be able to draw from them and take inspiration from them and see that what they were doing was good. And yeah, I agree with that. The only thing I sort of have a minor disagreement with her on, I didn't raise it at the time, maybe I should have, is this idea of communism, because I think on some level she's right, and people are right, because we do associate it with a modern ideology, a Marxist, largely, ideology. My point is that I want to broaden that. It's not that I want to take the Marxism out necessarily. I want us to be able to keep a sort of materialist critique, but it is important to recognise that communism is a far broader, older tradition that is inclusive of things that came before, and that scholars do use that to mean that. So for me, I have no problem with saying Jesus is a communist, both because he's still alive and because he's a communist.
So I think the important point to say is if you disagree with the statement Jesus is a communist, you are denying the resurrection and are a heretic.
Well, I mean, if you're a Christian and you're saying that, yes. If you're not a Christian and you're saying that, then you're not a heretic because you're not a Christian.
But you are denying the resurrection still, so yeah. Yeah.
Who's sounding evangelical now, Ben?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm sure we've mentioned this before, but definitely, like, all the evangelical impulses that were, like, given to me, I haven't got rid of them. I've simply transferred them over to politics from Christianity, right? Like,
and rugby, apparently.
Well, to be honest, I'm probably more, like, evangelical about, like, hey, listen to this band. It sounds like absolute shit and no one will enjoy them, but I love it. Yeah, I think, for me, I would not want to say Jesus was a communist, and I think for me there's something about that word communist being a description of something you do, not something you are. In the same way that, and again, this is classic, my evangelical impulses just transfer to politics, because this is something evangelicals talk about. A Christian is not something you are, it's something you do. It's a way of being in the world. Which, by the way, I think is basically correct, so I'm not having a go. But yes, I think to say Jesus was a communist, for me, doesn't feel quite right, because as far as we can see, he's not involved in any sort of communist organising. That's not to say he doesn't say some stuff that are extremely compatible and might even lead you towards that particular outlook on things, but I'm not sure I'd feel comfortable doing that. But in terms of the living Jesus who remains alive today, then absolutely he is currently a communist, because that is a way, not the only way, but a major way in which the kingdom of God is to be brought about in the world. So yeah, I think that's really quite important, that to talk about why we are pissing off other Christians and why you can now go to the shop and piss off other Christians too, by saying that Jesus is a communist. I have a question for you, Adam, which is whether currently we describe ourselves as a UK-based leftist Christian podcast, and we chose the word leftist after some thought because we felt like that was the most broad, and we wanted to kind of emphasise our generally non-sectarian approach to left politics, in that we are firmly on the left, on the radical left, but we also don't want to just be an anarchist or a Marxist-Leninist or a Trotskyist podcast. We are broadly trying to speak about the left.
Yeah. When the revolution happens, you and I will kill each other. But until that time...
Yeah. It will be the most pathetic fight to the death of all time. But yeah, should we abandon the word leftist and be using the word communist instead?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super keen on the word leftist. I also think it's a word that's gradually, like the word socialist, is gradually being subsumed into the sort of broader liberal programme.
Yes. Every time we come up with a word for ourselves, they steal it.
Yeah. I don't know. I use it, but then I'm always sort of fairly quick to say, and by that we mean that we are actually properly left-wing, not liberals cosplaying as socialists.
Well, maybe we'll consider. Maybe next time I'll introduce us as the British Communist Christian podcast.
Yeah, but then people will think that we're like both
tankies.
Yeah. And, I get why a lot of people who sort of are more my end of the left spectrum will be very kind of anti-tanky and so on. I don't want to particularly get into slagging off loads of people. I would have grave issues with certain elements, but I think it's one of the things I always return to is that rather than just throw everything out, we take the word communist and communism and we just throw it out, it's all bad. Actually, why don't we take a step back and have a slightly more nuanced discussion? Because communism is a very broad word, and the examples of it that we have had and we continue to have in the world, or, obviously these places would say that they haven't achieved communism, but, that caveat aside, I think it's important to be able to take a step back and say, well, what can we learn from these, from what they've done well and what they have not done well, rather than just say it's all bad or it's all good.
And if you're listening to this and you're like, what does tanky mean? What are you talking about? Do not look it up. Please continue to live your life in the blissful ignorance in which you live. I'm not even joking. Like, there is nothing to be gained by looking into this stuff. Just go on with your life. Try and be a good lefty.
They'll Google it. They'll Google it.
And I'm sorry. I really am. We tried to stop you. Right, I think it's time for us to head towards our main topic to really get going on Hot Digger Summer. Adam, it was great fun listening to the podcast last week. I learnt loads. I've had some interest in diggers and actually that period of history in a little while. I might have told the story before, but living in the area I live in, kind of East Anglia, particularly around Cambridgeshire, there was a bunch of stuff in like Ely and that sort of area named after Oliver Cromwell. And I realised that... Hey, did he or did he not commit regicide?
Did he or did he not commit genocide in Ireland?
Yes,
right?
yes. I'm not saying he's good, but I'm saying that we can't dismiss entirely a man who commits regicide.
No, you're bringing me back to the whole, nuance thing.
Yeah. The nuance here is 99% a complete wrong un, but possibly by accident, kind of did one cool thing. Anyway, I didn't know anything about him. I'm really bad. Like, my history knowledge is not great. I've been, over the last few years, been trying to improve it. And I was like, I need to find out what this guy's about. And then I heard someone mention about a book, like a historical fiction book that was about Cromwell. And so I read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I don't know if you know about this, Adam.
Yeah.
Do you know there's two Cromwells?
Yeah.
I think it's his nephew or something. And I got halfway through the book before being like, wait a minute. This isn't the right Cromwell, isn't it? But I did eventually learn some stuff about this period and Oliver Cromwell anyway. And it is really, really fascinating. And one of the things that I was thinking about while listening to the recording last week is to kind of draw some comparisons. And I don't want to do like one-to-one, this is how it happened and that's happening again now, because there's a lot of differences. But that kind of story of revolution, upheaval, new ideas that were really radical and different, gaining ground, gaining prominence, before ultimately a restoration and things going back to somewhat normal, but these ideas still bubbling under the surface. And I know that other people have drawn these comparisons. The phrase people have used is to talk about centrist restoration that's going on at the minute, right? To draw this comparison. You know, we had, post the 2008 financial crash, you had the Occupy movements, you had some of the UK Uncut stuff and various other kind of protest occupation movements, even in, mainstream politics, your Bernies, your Corbyns, and within that, very radical ideas like police abolition coming to the mainstream. And in, probably the last few years, there's been a real concerted effort to push that all back down, to have some sort of restoration process. And yeah, I don't know. I felt the comparison was quite interesting. Unfortunately, I can't think of who the diggers are in this stretched metaphor now. But to maybe think about what the diggers can say to us in our moment, and particularly recognising that the diggers remain something that is considered important and historically, relevant, even though ultimately they didn't actually achieve a great deal. Yeah,
I suppose we spoke about this a little bit with Liv about taking inspiration and how the diggers have been used. Certainly some of her research about the diggers, how they constructed an identity and how that's sort of been used today for various groups. I think certainly we can draw inspiration from them. I think the diggers had an approach that I think was a little bit naive. Sadly, I really love the diggers, but ultimately they believed that they could achieve all of this without reacting to any of the violence that was inflicted on them at all. And I just don't think that that's possible.
That's interesting because, I was saying, I don't know who the diggers are in a modern context. And when you put it like that, you do wonder if the Corbyn movement is that, right? In terms of that, good intentions, full of energy and new ideas, but ultimately, and I would absolutely include myself in this, somewhat naive about quite how big the pushback was going to be. Obviously, the vast, vast majority were not, physically threatened in any way, right? We're not talking about violence, so I don't want to over-egg that. But yeah, I guess there's something interesting about naivety, and maybe you have to be a little bit naive to believe that you can change things, but also you can't be too naive or you will just get crushed.
A lot of certainly more Marxist traditions will talk down about what they will call utopian socialists. And I think they have a definition of utopian socialism that often kind of doesn't always accord with those who would embrace that term. There's a wonderful podcast, much bigger than ours, called the Seriously Wrong podcast, who consider themselves utopian socialists. And that isn't so much about coming up with an idea. I mean, we talked about Robert Owen before, this guy who had some money. He was kind of rich, but he was a socialist, and he thought, well, if I buy this place to set up this community, and then, all these people, even the rich people, will give up their money and their lands and everything willingly. And that's a very similar thing to what the Diggers thought would happen with their movement, that people would just willingly give up their money and power and so on. And of course, it doesn't work like that. Money is so corrupting and power is so corrupting that people end up just wanting more and more of it. Utopian socialists, as far as some sort of Marxists are concerned, believe a very similar thing. But people who self-identify as utopians don't necessarily believe that. They sort of conceptualize their utopian kind of ideas as, well, we need to be able to have hope. It's something that Marx kind of actually himself didn't really like. He didn't like the idea of trying to think about what a future socialist society or communist society would look like. He did a little bit of that, but not a lot. Generally, he discouraged people from doing that. A lot of utopian socialists actually say, no, we need to be able to think about what it would look like. We need to be able to think about what new ideas we'll be able to put in place, how we would be able to think about things like property, about things like land and so on. And even, things like education. How do you think about the rights of children? So I'd really encourage people to go and listen to the Seriously Wrong podcast, because they talk about a lot of that stuff, and it's really fascinating and really encouraging and hopeful.
I think it's interesting. Engels talks about scientific socialism versus utopian socialism.
Yeah.
Failed miserably said the word socialism there. Utopian socialism.
Maybe you should start that sentence again, Ben.
No, we're keeping that in. That's just, if we restart a sentence every time I can't say a word, this is going to be an 8-hour-long podcast. It's a little Easter egg. Every week people get to work out what word I'm going to completely screw up saying. Engels talks a lot about socialism, scientific socialism versus utopian socialism. And at the time, the idea of scientific was kind of cool and radical and interesting, and utopian socialism was like silly and naive and whatever. But unfortunately, reading it today, it kind of just comes across as nerd socialism versus cool, fun socialism. So it doesn't quite work. Another thing that I wanted to pick up a little bit is the idea that Winstanley talks about of the earth being a common treasury for all, which is this really powerful quote, and I think it's really good. And it talks about, the idea of God's providence is going to be available to all people, not just the rich, and that's how things should be. But I'm also interested to think about it with kind of an environmental head-on, because in some ways, treating the earth as a common treasury has got us in a lot of mess. And I'm wondering how we kind of do approach the earth as a common treasury, or whether we need to rethink some of that idea, because it's a very popular idea, particularly amongst Christian communists and leftists. But yeah, I think it's potentially one that we might have to have another look at.
I want you to explain a bit more about that, Ben, because I'm not sure I agree.
Well, I guess from an environmental perspective, the problem that we have is that we've been treating the earth as a limitless resource. And I'm not saying Winstanley is saying, he doesn't say it's a common limitless treasury for all, right? Like a treasury is something with a limit.
Well, a treasury is something that you have to put into as well.
Ah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. I mean, that shows you a lot about my economics, is that I'm big on taking the money out. But yeah, I mean, my household budget would reflect that approach.
As we know, a household budget is not a good way to compare the economy of a country or the world.
That is true. But yeah, I guess I suppose that idea of treasury is something you pay into. It still alienates nature and the earth in some way. And there are, I think, helpful ideas about environmentalism that kind of encourage us to see the earth as something that we are part of and as part of us, and that nature is not something with a clear dividing line. And, actually, this is an idea in Marx as well that I think we might have to also be rethinking. That's right, I'm criticising Marx for once. Note it on your bingo cards, everyone.
Wow.
But, he definitely draws this very clear line between humans and nature. And nature is something you take raw materials from as part of the production process. And he's not unaware or uncritical of environmental issues, but there is ultimately this, very clear dividing line between nature and humanity. And we get this in kind of stewardship theologies, right, that says, it's our job to look after the earth. But actually, maybe it's our job to work with the earth, to be part of the earth, to live in harmony with the earth, not simply steward it, because that's still ultimately about us being in control of the earth's resources. And I'm wondering whether some ideas on Winstanley understandably don't take into account some of those environmental issues. And I know the guys at the Magnificast have been working on some stuff about St. Francis and environmentalism, but perhaps St. Francis offers a different way of thinking about the earth and nature that might be more helpful.
Yeah, I mean, the whole kind of brother, sun, sister, moon thing. I know that there are people. So Roger Hayden Mitchell, I think he's a Pentecostal theologian who critiques Francis on this because he says the whole brother, sun, sister, moon thing is, effectively turning sort of celestial bodies into beings, which of course would be deeply heretical. I think that's Roger Hayden Mitchell seems like a nice guy, but I think that's a fairly simplistic understanding of what Francis was doing there. Francis clearly didn't literally think that the sun and the moon were living beings, or at least didn't see them as in the same way that one would see a human or some kind of deity. But there is something about treating what we might call creation and bodies within creation as all in relationship with each other and with us. And I think that's what Francis does really well. I think the Franciscan tradition is a really beautiful tradition. I think I have some issues with some of the way that has come down to us today. There's a story, and I'll probably be bastardizing it, but there's a story of one of the brothers who was alongside Francis. Basically, someone donated some money to the church, and the brother saw this money and thought, "Oh, that's disgusting. We need to get that away from the altar." And he picked up this money and threw it onto some windowsill somewhere or something. And then Francis had a go at him and said, "How can you touch money? It's disgusting. You shouldn't even touch it."
So what? Should have been wearing gloves? Is that the message there?
I don't know what he wanted him to do with it. Maybe burn it. I don't know. But it's interesting that both of their reactions to someone donating money was to reject that money. Right? This is how radical we're actually talking here, and there's a radical edge to Franciscanism, if you like, to this day. But it's certainly not quite in the same vein that Francis himself would have had it. And there's some questions to, how feasible is that? I don't know. That's a discussion. But I certainly think that Francis is, as you say, that does offer us a really interesting way to look at some of these environmental issues. My issue would be that Franciscanism perhaps is a lot more interesting and radical on that than most, but could go further.
Yeah, I agree with that. So what do you think in terms of the common treasury? Is that a phrase that is a useful way of thinking, or do you think we may need to reassess that? I
think it's useful in context. Like most things, you can't just take a phrase and say, this is useful or it's not useful. If we're going to use that, the way we would find it useful is to say that it shouldn't be that land is just, and resources are just used and used up by a few people, that we need to work with the land together, that it's everyone's job and everyone's duty to think about this. And actually, I think that makes this a fairly profoundly democratic way of doing it. And I think what we know is that when things are properly democratic, and you're talking about the land that you live on or you live near, the land that is tied and associated with you, then when you do that through a democratic lens as a community, you want what's best for the land, and you want what's best for your community, because those two things are tied together. So I think there is a usefulness in it if you contextualize it properly.
Yeah, fair enough. And I'd say it's not really a criticism of Winstanley, because those environmental issues weren't happening. But it struck me that actually it's a very popular phrase, and rightly so, but it's maybe slightly more fraught in its usage than I had previously considered.
But it's also important to think about the fact that we are talking about a very early stage in the development of capitalism. capitalism couldn't have happened if it wasn't for the enclosure of the commons. And so it's a fairly profoundly anti-capitalist thing to think about the land in that way as well. And I think when we realise that capitalism is effectively what is causing the climate crisis, this sort of rapacious need for constant growth, for more, then when we realise that when Stanley saying that the earth is a common treasury for all goes against that capitalist impulse, actually that also can be really helpful when we're thinking about issues of, the environment, of climate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other impulse I kind of was thinking about in there is this idea of returning to the land. As you say, this idea of reclaiming the commons in the face of enclosure is really, really important. I thought it was fascinating. I'd never really considered that actually they were not just trying to grab something back in terms of saying, well, this is how we've always used the commons, but actually the diggers were proposing to use the commons in a very different way. They were still claiming it for everyone, so there was a sense of recognising that the enclosure was thieving from the people, but the way they wanted to use it was a different way. And I thought it was interesting to think about. There is a telling of the diggers' story that is almost an eco-fascist telling of it, which is about returning to the land, cities and modern progress or whatever. It's all awful. What we need to do is return properly to the land and all be agricultural again. And part of this is that I am not a rural person. So the idea of returning to the land scares me a little bit. I don't think I have a job on the rural commune. I think I will be used as fertiliser.
Well, I mean, a big part of that is simply about how you and I and we all have been raised. Like, you're not rural because that's just a fundamentally different lifestyle to what you're used to. And actually, even the way that we think of the rural, the countryside, in the way we do that, the way we manage that, in terms of sort of farming, things like monoculture and sort of intensive farming of animals for meat, that can't continue, right? Yeah. That's one of the things that we absolutely have to change and to deal with. And so I think on some level, I understand what you're saying. Oh, I'm not a rural person. There'll be nowhere for me. But I don't agree with that, because actually a reconceptualization and a rediscovery of the knowledge and the tools and so on of how we would need to manage that land, I think would turn you into someone who was, far more used to being rural. And that's not to say there isn't a role for, cities and towns and so on, of course. It's just to say that I think that we have essentially been de-skilled. And so it's quite possible to think that's a bit scary. I'm not sure that there would be a place for me, or maybe I'd be fertilized. But actually, probably there wouldn't be. Probably you would be able to learn these things. There are ways to be a part of that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I'm also quite wary of some of those ideas around, like, yes, we should be doing much more small crops. Like, it would be great if people were growing up more of their own food and all that sort of stuff. But at the same time, I think a desire to essentially return to feudalism as a response to the climate crisis, I think is quite dangerous.
Yes.
Not to mention unrealistic thing. And I do think there's the way of, I don't know, I'd never heard before this idea that the diggers were not simply reclaiming the commons in the way that it had always been used, but actually proposing a whole new way of using it. I think that's really important, is that we're not trying to just undo what's been done and go back in time.
Yeah, we're not harking back to that kind of past, that romanticized idea of the past.
Yeah. And actually something to really take from the diggers is that there is an opportunity to reclaim what has been lost, but reclaim it in ways that are new, if that makes sense. And that's quite a difficult needle to thread. There we go.
Got there in the end.
I'm also not good at sewing as well as rural stuff. I don't have a lot of practical skills. But I will look after the teenagers on the commune. So, I think people will be grateful for that. I know you're going to tell me that teenagers is something that's a concept that's been invented by capitalism, but don't take this away from me. But yeah, I thought it was really fascinating to think about that, actually, that there was something quite subtle going on with the diggers, where they were both reclaiming something that has been taken or was in the process of being taken, whilst also not simply saying we need to go back to how things were, but saying that has always been ours and actually we need to do something new with it. And I think that's a really profound and insightful thing to reflect on in terms of how we approach acknowledging what has been taken from us by capitalism, whilst also not simply making that, well, let's just go back to how things were argument.
Yeah, and I think actually this talks also to a kind of anarcho-primitivist impulse as well. We've all seen the sort of return to monkey memes.
Yeah.
But actually, for some of us, that's a very scary prospect because it would involve mass death and suffering on a grand scale. I am someone who needs there to be, a certain amount of industry, a certain amount of, what one might call civilization, because there are drugs that I need in order to survive or not be in pain, or be in less pain. And so, if it hadn't been for these things, I wouldn't have survived birth, let alone a bunch of the things that happened to me later on. So I think, it's important that kind of looking at what one might conceive as some form of progress rather than sort of going back to something, to an imagined past. I'm not for that. Not for that.
That's fair. Adam, would you like a saint of the week?
Oh, go on then.
Saint of the week.
You already did your whole, this is Ben speaking, not me, but I really want to emphasise, this is my saint of the week, and Adam and Lou may not agree with my sainting this person. So I have been reading the book The World Turned Upside Down by Christopher Hill, which was
referenced.
Yeah, I was reading it before I heard that, actually, and it is a kind of history from below approach to this period. He calls it the English Civil Wars. We obviously should call it the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. But in it, Christopher Hill tries to tell the stories of the general people and what they were thinking and doing and giving them some agency and voice back in their historical conversation rather than just focusing on the lords and kings and protectors and all the rest of it. And it's a really fascinating book that I highly recommend. There are loads of crazy radical Christians in there. And the one that I would like to talk about today is a man called Abiza Kopp, or Cope. Most people pronounce it Cop, but I prefer Cope because I don't want the guy to be a cop. So Abiza is born in 1619 in Warwick. He goes to Oxford University. Boo! But he gets better from there. He spends some time as a preacher to an army garrison. Okay, he gets better from there. Before becoming the de facto leader of the Ranters. I think you mentioned the Ranters a bit last week, but not in any detail. They are one of the radical religious sects around during this period, possibly the most radical religious, or certainly radical Christian community, I think. One of the fascinating things in the book is that basically the Quakers have to work really hard to be like, we are not these guys, but there is possibly some overlap there. Before we talk about what he believed, I want to just talk about the two pamphlets he wrote because they both have absolutely cracking names. So the first he publishes is called Some Sweet Sips of Spiritual Wine. And the second is called Fiery Flying Rolls.
This is great.
Yeah. Theology books these days and theology pamphlets these days don't have good enough names. I want more stuff like this. A lot more alliteration would be appreciated. So, Cope's conception of God is a very internal conception. He says his message comes from the excellent majesty and eternal glory in me. People weren't God. He kind of gets accused sometimes of thinking that people are God, but he kind of rejects that. But he says people do partake in the divine nature. It's hard to tell exactly. He certainly flirts with not being an Orthodox creedal Christian. He kind of pulls back a little bit, but he certainly... A lot of people feel like he's not really Orthodox or not really a proper Christian, which is cool and fine.
I mean, that was generally the idea of the Ranters, wasn't it? Like, most people just thought that they were a bit mental.
So his big idea is the levelers who had died, they were martyrs and that God would be avenging them. But he was a pacifist and said that Ranters refused to fight for anything. That's not what we do, but that God would have his vengeance. Not entirely clear how God was going to get his vengeance without some fighting happening, but that was what he believed. Apparently, he reports to us that he goes into the street and he shouts at rich people, has a go at them, and then bows deeply before what he calls rogues, beggars, and cripples. He gets a fair amount of notoriety, and Parliament actually commands that his pamphlets are publicly burnt for heresy, and he is so proud of this fact.
I love that.
And it reminds me of the Simpsons bit where Homer's like, see, because of me, they have a warning. Like,
we haven't put enough Simpsons clips in recently, have we? Maybe we'll have to put one in.
Yeah, that'll go in there perfectly.
Tonight on Eye on Springfield, just miles from your doorstep, hundreds of men are given weapons and trained to kill. The government calls it the Army. But a more alarmist name would be the Killbot Factory. But first, Springfield has come down with a fever. Football fever brought on by the biggest game of the year. The Pigskin Classic between the Shelbyville Sharks and our own Springfield Atoms. If you have the fever, there's only one cure. Take 2 tickets and see the game Sunday morning.
Warning, tickets should not be taken internally.
See, because of me, now they have a warning.
He has some quite complicated ideas about sin. He's accused of saying things like adultery aren't a sin, but he kind of replies and says, I do think adultery is a sin, but most people who make a big deal of sins like that are usually actually committing far greater sins and are hypocrites.
Which is just a fact.
Yeah, I mean, he's not wrong. He has a much bigger emphasis on the sinfulness of like pride, oppression, tyranny, lack of mercy, not helping the poor. These are like the serious sins. He does the whole everyone is a sinner thing that, you know, like evangelicals are like everyone is a sinner.
Yeah.
As a way of being like, but really, the gays are the worst sinners. Only he's pretty open about the fact that no, he thinks some people are worse sinners and they're the rich people. Ranters are probably most famous for loving to drink, smoke and swear. They're accused of being sexually promiscuous outside of marriage. They're kind of accused of basically being polygamous. They do deny this, and Cope says, no, we're not. But the evidence suggests that they had a much freer approach to sexuality than the established church, I guess. And there's all these big ideas changing in terms of love and marriage being more about, marriage being more about love and less about property transactions, which is obviously part of that kind of Protestant Reformation and all these kind of Puritan changes and all the rest of it. But Christopher Hill makes the point that actually the common people and working class people always had a very different conception of marriage and sexuality than the posh people. And so actually some of these ideas about sex outside of marriage and all this sort of stuff probably did reflect some more normal ideas and the kind of normal approach amongst the common people that was looked down by the posh people. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. He certainly sits well outside the mainstream of Christianity, but he's quite insistent that he is still a Christian. And I'm just going to finish the Saint of the Week with this wonderful quote from him. Howl, howl, ye nobles, howl, ye honourable, howl, ye rich, rich men, for the miseries that are coming upon you. We'll eat our bread together in singleness of heart. We'll break bread from house to house. The true communion amongst men is to have all things in common, and to call nothing one hath one's own. I've slightly pushed that, like there was slightly more there, so I've slightly, before anyone accuses me of misrepresenting him, I've cut some stuff out from that, but that is all what he has said, and I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, he sounds insane. I love it.
Yeah.
I've got the Wikipedia page up of him because I don't have the Christopher Hill book to hand. I do have it, but I don't have it to hand. And there's some wonderful lines just in the Wikipedia page. The end of the biography section, it says, in 1657, he apparently changed his name to Dr. Hyam and was buried under that name at Barnes Church in 1672. Just changed his name to Dr. Hyam for some reason. Doesn't say why.
As you do.
Yeah.
People did seem to do a lot of changing their names. That comes up on the book.
Yeah.
And it's super effective for being like, if you just change your name and leave the area, you basically get away with most things that you've done.
Yeah, well, you would back then, yeah. There's another bit in this, though, that really makes me laugh. It says Cope was later released and celebrated by publishing Cope's Return to the Ways of Righteousness, in which he retracted his previous heresies while adding a few more. Yeah.
Well, this is ranters particularly, because they kind of didn't think... They had some complicated ideas of sin that I don't want to go into fully, but they basically thought it was fine to retract their views to avoid punishment, even if they still believed those views, Like they were not interested at all in being martyrs if they could help it. So they were just like, they would be like caught and be like, do you believe this stuff? They'd be like, no, not me, Gov. No, I don't believe any of that stuff. And they're like, okay, fine, see you later. And then immediately be like, no, I did believe all that stuff. So, but it was really hard to get them, like, to try them properly for heresy or sedition or whatever, because they'd just be like, nah, I don't believe any of that stuff, mate. Like, they had no sense that they should, like, stand by that stuff in trial or in public, if it was going to get them in trouble, and it made it super hard for them to actually, like, nail them down.
Yeah, and I mean, there's, that's perhaps sort of foreshadowing sort of later philosophical ideas around what truth is and what a deeper truth is, and is it okay to lie if you're in service of a deeper truth that is preventing death, that kind of thing.
It is, and it's also okay to lie in this case where it's just kind of funny.
Well, yeah, it does make me laugh at least.
One thing I did think though that struck me is this major difference between these radical Christians then. They're all, to a greater or less extent, seen as outside of mainstream Christianity, unorthodox, pushing against established ideas of Christianity. Whereas I think there is a tendency, and not universal, but I would say as a rule of thumb, your modern leftist Christian is quite concerned with being orthodox, and actually often kind of is making the point that we belong in orthodoxy, and some of the conservative conceptions of Christianity are possibly outside of orthodoxy.
Which, I mean, we do ourselves on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fairly regularly.
Yeah.
Yeah, but sort of in a similar vein, though, it's interesting to me how many of these people in these movements from back then, like their ideas were seen as mad at the time, but now some of those ideas and ways of being, like most people in the mainstream do them or agree with them.
Smoking, swearing, and drinking, right? Like,
right? Yeah.
Like all those things are cool and fun.
Is that the official line of the pod? Or?
I don't know. We did a whole episode about alcohol, which I was surprised at how negative it was on alcohol. So, as the least alcohol-consuming podcast in our particular sphere, I suspect. I don't think we are taking that line, but it is, it's normalised, right? You wouldn't be that scandalised to discover that your local evangelical church had people that smoked and swore and drank, right? Like, that'd be just normal.
Well, we spoke about Clergy Malt Club, didn't we?
Yeah, exactly.
Which, for anyone who didn't catch that episode, is it after midnight mass, where clergy will share on social media. They'll go home and they will drink some whiskey and then share what kind of whiskey they're drinking on social media. And that is on some level, a normalization of that. But then, it's important to remember, I think, that Jesus was a bit of a party animal, Like, Jesus loved to party. Jesus loved to drink. Jesus turned water into wine, So I don't think it's right to be entirely down on this kind of thing.
Yeah.
We don't want to be too repressed, do we?
Well, no more than we already unfortunately are, I think.
Yeah.
That's just being British, though, isn't it?
Yeah, imagine how bad we've got it. For anyone who's not British or Christian who's listening, imagine how bad we've got it. We are British. We were Christians who grew up evangelical. Yeah.
You have no idea the levels of repression we're working on here. Like, I don't know. It's just fascinating, isn't it? And it made me think that maybe, I don't know, I do kind of have this desire to reaffirm my orthodoxy, but I don't know, maybe I should be less clingy to that. I mean, obviously, you and Lou is... have to be.
It's a bigger problem for you in a sense, Ben, because you're trying to reaffirm something that doesn't exist.
Okay, right then. I don't know. Maybe it's a... maybe there is a value in it, but I was fascinated by, not to say the theology that we espouse isn't radical in some ways, but actually, I don't know, I'm dangerously close to labelling this radical orthodoxy, which we're absolutely not.
Let's just step back from that particular precipice, shall we?
But it is, I don't know, we have a commitment on this podcast, definitely, in the past, to try and be like, we are within the mainstream orthodoxy of Christianity, and yet, I don't know, these guys seem pretty chill about not being in the Christian mainstream, and maybe that's something to think about. Actually, in terms of identity formation, would be fascinating to think about that.
Well, and sort of within that, though, I think it's also important to think about how we conceptualize ideas of orthodoxy and blasphemy and heresy and that kind of thing, because those boundaries, those sort of boundary markers, if you like, of a faith are movable and malleable and impermanent. So the things that back then people would have said were heterodox or heretical are not necessarily the same things today that most people would say were heterodox or unorthodox or whatever.
I do wonder if there's something about, it feels like quite a Protestant instinct to me. To, you don't have to be, if you're already Catholic, you're already in the Church Universal, right? But because there's this higher emphasis on what you believe and what you confess over necessarily being just a part of that community, I do wonder if maybe there's a greater desire to, in some ways, if you're Catholic, you're in, right? You don't have to. I get it's more complex than that, but what I'm saying is that there's a Protestant impulse to have to reaffirm, because we've separated from the historical, particularly, Church of England obviously tries to, claim that inheritance, but if you're outside of that particularly, you maybe don't have that direct historical link to historic Christianity, and therefore you're maybe trying to ideologically reaffirm that, rather than being comfortable that you're part of that church.
I mean, I think there's some truth to that impulse being a thing, but I think the reality of it might look a little bit different, because Protestantism is not really one ism, is it? Protestantism is many, many different churches, many, many different denominations that can have wildly different theologies. Catholicism, yes, there's difference within that. Roman Catholicism I'm talking about here. But Roman Catholicism has this tendency towards centralized power. And so it's actually easier to be kicked out. It's easier to be told by those who are gatekeeping that, who have the power in that, for them to tell you that you are no longer a Catholic, you have excommunicated yourself. Whereas in Protestantism, there's not really, yes, individual denominations have people with more or less power in them, but as a general rule, there's not really that centralized authority in quite the same way that there is in Roman Catholicism.
No, you're absolutely right. And obviously, my knowledge of Catholicism is relatively limited, so I don't want to. I was using it as a comparison. I don't want to make it sound like, it's really easy to be a Catholic. There's no grass is always green on the other side, I guess. I think that will do us for this week. Thank you for joining us for the beginning, or the continuation, I guess, of Hot Digger Summer. It's been really interesting to reflect more on that stuff. I'm sure there's plenty more things that we can talk about the kind of radical history of that period. So we'll return to that at some point. Thank you, Adam, for joining me. Where in the world can people find you?
You can find me most places at Commie XIAN.
Cool. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast feedy places. We have a Facebook, facebook.com/breadandrosaries. We are on Twitter. We are not going to be calling it by its new name, at bread_rosaries.
No, neither has anyone else. If this whole lawsuit thing comes off, what an idiot!
Let's not even do it. Let's not do a podcast about Elon Musk. You can email us, breadandrosaries@gmail.com. You can rate, review us, or you can get hold of us. We'd love to hear people's thoughts, opinions. We do have a website, as mentioned, breadandrosaries.com. There's some cool stuff up on there, including a Patreon. And thank you very much, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure. We'll see you all next time. Thanks, Adam. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Get it up. I got my heart sound blasting through my speakers now. I got a whole town feeling the vibration now. Got a hot girl stepping through the beat right now. Hey, do it all. I don't want much, I just wanna turn it up. I got many options, but I choose to ball on myself, and I love it when I'm vibing hard. Hey, I just wanna be so stylish. I just wanna be unlardish. Never wanna be like all this. Might be on crazy fashion, but I not be in movies. That'll be like all these actors. Better go live your life. You done got too much time. You're looking at me, wanna be like hype. I don't really get it, where they never satisfied. Really gonna focus on myself, on my sound. Every single time I drop a line. If that's the only good visit, I'm alive, then it's gonna be enough. I'm good with that. If that's the only good visit, I'm alive, then it's gonna be enough. I'm good with that. Get it up. I got my heart sound blasting through my speakers now. Let me see if I got a whole